GETTYLord Heseltine claimed that a Corbyn government would be less damaging to Britain, yet his claim that a Corbyn government would be less damaging to Britain than leaving the EU has created huge excitement among Remainers and Corbynites. "We have survived Labour governments before," he said. "The damage tends to be short-term and capable of rectification. Brexit is not short-term and is not easily capable of rectification. There will be those who question whether the short-term pain justifies the avoidance of the long-term disaster." The last line, with its implicit call for people to vote Labour, led Lord Tebbit to question whether Heseltine is still fit to hold the Conservative Party whip in the Lords. Whether Heseltine really believes that a Corbyn government would be preferable to Brexit is another matter. A more likely explanation is that he has become so obsessed with Brexit that he is prepared to say virtually anything if he thinks it would keep Britain in the EU. To Lord Heseltine and his pro-EU cronies, voting to leave the EU was an act of national self-harm. But even die-hard Remainers might struggle to see how it can compete with the masochism of wishing for a Corbyn government. Were Britain to elect a Corbyn government, Lord Heseltine would be one of its first victims. This year, Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell was filmed advocating a 20% wealth tax on the richest 10% of UK residents. For Lord Heseltine, whose wealth has been estimated at £300 million, that would mean writing a cheque to the taxman for £60 million. GETTYLord Heseltine said damage from a Labour government has been short-term and capable of rectification. Few will care about Lord Heseltine's personal financial well-being, were he forced to sell his Northamptonshire country seat. With its 400 acres, that wouldn't in itself constitute a national crisis. It wouldn't just be the super-wealthy who faced financial disaster, though. The irresponsible fiscal plans being laid by Corbyn and McDonnell would affect every level of society, including those dependent on state benefits who would eventually find the payments being slashed, as Britain found itself having to obey the demands of its creditors. Labour's spending plans never were properly challenged during the election campaign. Its manifesto promised public spending increases, for starters, of £48.6 billion, excluding the cost of planned nationalisations. The party's explanation of how this extra revenue would be raised was pure fantasy. Labour's spending plans never were properly challenged during the election campaign. Impossibly, £19.4 billion was to come from jacking up corporation tax from 19% to 26%. The idea that you can levy extra taxes on highly mobile international corporations is naive, to say the least, especially when the government has just proved the opposite. As corporation tax has been lowered, the tax take has actually increased. Labour claimed that another £6.4 billion would come from raising income tax from the richest 5%. Yet wealthy individuals too are highly mobile. The idea that they would sit in Britain and willingly pay swinging wealth taxes is ridiculous. Many would do what they did in the 1970s: flee across the Atlantic. The real cost of Labour's spending plans would fall on those who can't emigrate at the drop of a hat, just as it did in the 1970s, when Britain found itself reduced to the humiliation of going cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund, an organisation more used to supporting the public finances of developing countries. Saturday, September 24, 2016. Jeremy Corbyn MPR hugs Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell after being announced as the leader of the Labour Party. On the eve of the party's annual conference at the ACC on September 24, 2016, meanwhile, it emerged yesterday that a Corbyn government would reverse much of the trade union legislation banning secondary picketing and so on that helped bring the country to its knees in the 1979 winter of discontent. Lord Heseltine remembers all this very well. He certainly wasn't overly keen on socialism at the time. For many years he was best known for an act of parliamentary defiance in 1976 when he snatched the mace in the Commons chamber and waved it at the Labour benches, incensed by Labour MPs singing the red flag after winning a narrow vote to nationalise the shipbuilding industry. 20 years later he was going round telling us that even Tony Blair's much milder Labour Party presented a grave threat to Britain, accusing the electorate of sleepwalking. into the sort of disastrous policies that Labour in power has always been responsible for. Yet now Heseltine seems to expect us to believe that he thinks a Corbyn government, which would be way to the left of Tony Blair's and well leftwards of Jim Callaghan's 1970s government, would present no great price to pay if it meant Britain staying in the EU. That last point, of course, is a very big if. As much as one can decipher a coherent Labour policy on Brexit, a Corbyn government would be committed to leaving the EU. Getty. John McDonnell advocated a 20% wealth tax on the richest 10% of UK residents if Labour came out fully against leaving the EU, which Heseltine seems to think it could do. It certainly wouldn't be winning a general election. Labour only did well in June because it won back votes from UKIP. In any case, Corbyn himself has hardly been an EU enthusiast. He was one of many left-wing Labour figures who voted in 1975 for Britain to leave the then common market. That is the reality Lord Heseltine will face if he succeeds in persuading pro-Remain Tories to vote for Corbyn, a country that is broke, from which most entrepreneurs have fled, and which will leave the EU anyway.